to COVID, the state threw a lot at different parts of the system to try to make sure that these issues around potential recession and so on were mitigated. Are you planning to do anything like that? And are you looking at the fiscal rules at all?
Well, some of the support that we put in is more in the nature of breaking down the barriers that are in the way, and I think the state can and should do much more of that. So, for example, yesterday on the Z mandate, it was introducing a degree of flexibility rather than putting money behind something. Other examples would be what we're doing on planning and infrastructure, where again, it's not so much putting money in, it's changing the way the state operates, if you like.
So we know about those, but are there anything that you're looking at other than what you've already put in place or planning to put in place as a result of last week?
Oh yeah, there's a whole host of things. I'm starting with the sectors that are most obviously impacted, because obviously we've got the 10% reciprocal tariff, but for cars it's up at 25%. I was at JLR yesterday, you see the impact there. For steel, there's obviously concern. Already it's challenging with Scunthorpe or Talbot. The committee will know all of those issues. And we're yet to see what the situation will be for life sciences. But therefore I've started with the three sectors likely to be most impacted. But I'm absolutely clear in my own mind that what we're doing in terms of going further and faster needs to be across the board. That was always my view. It needs to go further and faster now.
Okay, thank you for that for now. Mr Belless, MP.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for joining us, Prime Minister. I was very pleased because I have people who work at JLR, albeit at Halewood, that you were at JLR at Solihull yesterday in the support you gave to the car industry. But I want to talk about steel as well. It's obviously a very, very urgent situation at Scunthorpe. I know you visited, and one of the asks that seems to be coming out is for the government to provide the support, and maybe this fits in what you just described as changing how the state operates, and that support through buying raw materials to keep production going. Is that one of the things that might still be on the table, or other alternatives being looked at? Because clearly it's a very serious situation. I know you're committed to steel. Yeah,
well, look, I mean, thank you for raising Scunthorpe. We are in the middle of discussions, so I hope the committee will forgive me if I don't go through each of the fine detail. But I'm absolutely committed to steel production in this country. All of our plans are going to require infrastructure and more steel in this country. So the last thing we want to do is to lose our capacity on steel. That's why we set aside quite a chunk of money, £2.5 billion, on top of the money we put into Port Talbot, which got a better deal there. For Scunthorpe, I've spent some time at Scunthorpe talking to the management, talking to the workforce there, and I know firsthand the impact that any loss of capacity at Scunthorpe would have on the workforce and the community and the country. Therefore, we will keep talking. We have made an offer, but all options are on the table in relation to Scunthorpe. I think it's really important, and we're in the middle of those discussions at the moment. Yes,
I think we're keen to learn what all options being on the table means in more detail, if there is anything you can say, Prime Minister.
Well, I don't want to be unhelpful to the committee, but as you can imagine, these are ongoing discussions at the moment. I can reassure the committee that we're doing everything we can to ensure there's a bright future for Scunthorpe.
Okay.
But as to precisely where we've got to in those talks, I'll very happily provide you with further details as soon as I can. There's no problem with that.
Sure.
It's just
there's
a limit to what I can say right here at the moment. I hope that's understandable.
Thank you for that. And I was at Port Talbot with the Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
They were saying to me how frustrating it is and how worrying it is that the blast furnaces shut there some years before the new electric arc furnaces will be opened. Very encouraged, very pleased with the government support for the new technology, but that gap is a reminder of previous deindustrialisation. How do you make sure that those fears are allayed, whether it's in South Wales or in Scunthorpe or anywhere else?
Oh, we've absolutely got to grip this. What you touch on is hugely important. It's the same story in Scunthorpe. I talked through with the team there. To go from the blast furnace to the electric arc furnace is a step they want to take, as they're doing at Port Talbot. For the electric arc furnace at Scunthorpe, when I was there, it may have changed a little bit since then, they said they could get the new furnace up and running by about 27, 28, but they got a connection point from the grid of 2034. That is what set me off on the work that we need to reform the way the grid operates. This is all part and parcel of going further and faster, because you cannot have a situation where there's such a big gap between finishing one capability and going on to the next capability. And it's not tolerable to have a gap that is caused, in that particular case, by the slowness of the grid to be able to connect up to the arc furnace. That was the problem in Scunthorpe, slightly different version in Port Talbot. But these are some of the barriers that have to be knocked out of the way. We cannot operate in environments that go so slowly.
Absolutely, Prime Minister, and my committee has heard detailed evidence to make the points you make extremely well. The timeframes you set out, though, are several years away, in some cases considerably beyond the date of the next general election. How are you going to make sure people are better off at the end of the Parliament than they were at the beginning?
In terms of net zero and steel, or more generally?
Both. But I think there is this real concern with the growth figures. As we're talking about.
I mean, more generally, there are things that we have been able to do at speed. So, for example, we've had the highest levels of investment into the country for 20 years. In the last 9 months, we've been able to adjust the living wage just last week by £1,400. So the lowest paid in our society got a pay rise. We've been able to ensure that interest rates have come down now 3 times for those on mortgages. That's a huge issue. And we've created 190,000 jobs. So there are things that are already happening, along with things like the waiting list coming down for the NHS, which of course is a health issue on the one hand, but is also an issue of the economy, because people can be faster back into work. So there are things that we can do more immediately. Other things take longer, but I don't accept that things like the grid just have to wait, and that's why, without going into all the things on the grid, but one of the things is to get rid of the old queuing system so that we can prioritise. Your committee will be across this, so we can reduce those time straight away, because we cannot have infrastructure projects taking forever in this country, which is what they've been doing for a very, very long time. And that's where we need to be bolder, go further, go faster, and just get these barriers out of the way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Esselstyn. Ruth Cadbury MP.
Thank you very much. Prime Minister, given the US President has imposed a 25% tariff on car imports, yesterday's announcements by you and the Transport Secretary to support the rollout of EVs was obviously welcomed by UK vehicle manufacturers. But Prime Minister, drivers really need more incentive to switch to EVs, particularly those who don't have ability to charge their vehicle at home. So, and in the UK, we've got geographically very weak infrastructure, very poor level of charging points outside of London and the southeast, and also the price differential to charge. If you can't charge off your domestic supply, you're paying 20%, not 5% VAT, and significantly. And you're also paying for the operator charges.
Yeah.
So it's not that easy to incentivise people to change. Is the Prime Minister and the government looking at this? And do you have any specific thoughts?
Yeah, thank you for raising that, because I think it's a really important point. I think there are a number of things that need to be done. The 2 things that I think that impact people most in their decision whether to swap to an electric vehicle or not are, first, the crossover price. At the point at which it's as cheap to buy an electric vehicle as it is to buy a diesel or petrol vehicle will be a very significant period. I keep bearing down on that date, which is the late 20s at the moment, but that will be a very significant date, because that's the upfront cost of buying in the first place. The second is an anxiety about charging points, and that's why we put more money behind the infrastructure for charging points, to a point where there ought to be one being built every half an hour from here on in. But it was amongst the announcements I made yesterday. It wasn't a new announcement, to be fair. Most of what I said yesterday was new in the terms of the flexibility. This was a reassertion of our commitment on charging points. I also want to tilt the question of if there's any missing of targets by those that build cars in terms of carbon. I want to make sure that any of the money that then becomes available is paid into a fund that deals with things like infrastructure in this country, because I think you're absolutely right. That's where the pinch point is. That's what people are worried about. So it's, can I afford it in the first place? What's the crossover price? 2, and am I going to be able to get to A to B and charge it appropriately and cheaply along the way? They're the 2 things that for me would make a material difference.
And I hope you'll look at the geographic point as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
If you live in a block of flats or nowhere near, if you can't charge out of your home supply, you know, you can't even charge at all, let alone have an issue about range anxiety. But
there's also the technology, because the new Range Rover, I think, now does 500 miles on its battery, which is way beyond what it could have done a few years ago. We will get into that space, but you're absolutely right.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to move on to rail, because your announcements at the weekend on rail schemes, particularly around the Trans-Pennine route upgrade, they were very welcome for those areas, but it was only £415 million, and all the elements had previously been announced. So is the government being more ambitious, and particularly to look at significant rail infrastructure in the north, repurposed HS2 route north of Birmingham, and also the Northern Powerhouse rail link across the Pennines?
Yep, I mean, firstly, on the 415 million, that was additional money. So that wasn't the only money. That was on additional to the money that's already been committed, which is in several billions of pounds. I think the whole project, if memory serves, is about 10 billion. So it was more money towards that. That's why it was welcome. But in relation to the broader point you make, yes, we do want to ensure that we've got better transport infrastructure. My view is the best way to ensure that we get what we need is to work with locally elected representatives, particularly the mayors, on what they say is the priority for them. And that's why we're working with the mayors in Manchester, in Liverpool, West Midlands, West Yorkshire, etc., to devise the plan with them. I think the idea of somebody sitting in Westminster or Whitehall and deciding what is the best transport infrastructure for Yorkshire or across east to west, Manchester, Liverpool, across to Bradford, Leeds and Hull, that should be determined with locally elected leaders. And so that has to be a joint plan, if you like, and that's the way we're approaching it. Okay,
thank you. Competitor countries, in terms of rail infrastructure, have more innovative ways of funding funding rail infrastructure, particularly working with the private sector. The Rail Industry Association has just done a report encouraging the government to look at land value capture, energy generation, using station property to develop housing, and so on, as a way of bringing in additional funding to develop much needed rail infrastructure. Will the government be looking at those?
Yeah, I do want to look at projects like that, and thank you for raising it, because I think if you look at our ambition to build 1.5 million homes and ask yourself the question, where would you start with those homes? It would be in and around railway stations and the like, where there's quite a lot of land, which is of quite reasonable value, and I think therefore we can bring the two together. So we are actively exploring what more we can do there for the very reasons that you set out.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
Ferguson MP.
Prime Minister, Scotland's space sector is leading the way through the development of a spaceport at Saxavord in Shetland. How confident are you that the government fully grasps the economic potential of the space launch sector in Scotland?
I think it's got huge potential. I think there are a number of places in Scotland, whether it's space, whether it's Grangemouth, which obviously has its challenges but has fantastic potential as far as I'm concerned. I think that there are a number of places in Scotland where we should build our strategy for growth, and that would be one of them.
Thank you for that. Saxavord itself is facing very strong competition from Norway, from Andoya, who had a successful test launch last month. And I wondered what the government could do to maintain Scotland's competitive edge and ensure we consolidate that position. One of the things the industry has suggested is that we should have a standalone minister for space to help it negotiate all the various jurisdictions and authorities that it has to work with. Is that something you would consider?
That hasn't been put to me yet, but it now has. Like all good points, I'll take it away and think about it. My instinct is not always to sort of create a new post, because I'm not always sure that is what delivers. But on the other hand, there is real potential there, as you rightly say, and there's probably more that we could and should do, working with the Scotland office, who've actually just published their plan for growth in Scotland. Let me take it away, but I don't want to raise expectations, because I'm not a particular fan of just creating more and more posts. But it doesn't mean... Sorry?
Or to just create more and more posts.
Well, there's that as well. Yeah. but I mean, I don't want to miss the point, because it is a really important point about where in Scotland are the really important growth potential, and I think that is one of them. I think there are plenty of others as well, particularly in the renewables.
A European launch capability in Scotland could actually be vital to the UK and Europe's future defence and security. Given the rapidly evolving global security picture, what is the government doing to ensure that the commercial development of Scotland's space sector is aligned with the UK's defence and national security objectives?
All of this has to be aligned, and I think one of the important changes that we need to look at as we go through our strategic review is how we bind our defence and security sector more closely to the private sector, and how we make sure that, whether it's space or any other capability, that defence is part of our story on economic growth. I think there's been a tendency up until now to sort of see defence and security in a sort of a silo, if you like, of its own, ring-fenced from the other challenges on growth, when in fact it could be and should be a really powerful driver of growth. So I think we need to bring the two more closely together, and that's what we'll do. Our strategic review will be published in due course, but I'm absolutely clear in my mind that we need a better economic story around our defence spend, which is going to go up because of the percentage increase that we've put in. And of course, across Europe, other countries are increasing their spend, which I think increases the potential for our capacity in the United Kingdom. And of course, Scotland's got a very interesting and important story to tell on this, whether it's the building of the shipbuilding, obviously the submarines, etc. This is a big part of Scotland's history and heritage and future.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Excellent. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown MP.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister.
Good afternoon.
I hope you won't mind me following up a question which I asked you at the last meeting of this committee on AI. And you've been very clear that AI and digital coordination have the potential to significantly boost productivity in the civil service excuse me, and across the public sector. This will partly involve more money to replace the large number of legacy IT systems and procure new ones. However, the biggest change would be to transform the way the civil service works.
Yeah.
Now, a theme that has emerged across our really diverse range of hearings in the Public Accounts Committee would be to embed digital and cyber information officers at senior management levels and on the senior boards in every department of the civil service. Is that something you might consider?
Yes, I think it's really vital, and we want to double the number of civil servants working in data and digital roles by 2030, so increase the volume. There will be, incentives for that. We've got 2,000 tech track apprentices in place for that very reason. I think this can be transformative, not just to the services that are externally delivered, but as you say, to the heart of government in relation to some of the tasks that are being done. And I'm certainly pushing this forward from the centre, if you like. I think this sort of transformation only really happens if number 10 is absolutely full square behind it. And so I'm personally pushing this all of the time, because I think this will be transformative of what we can do, how we can do it, and it releases individuals to be more human. if the AI does the bits like the collation of information, I mean, for example, on planning, we think we can use AI to collate a lot of the available information, put it into the right format, so the decision maker can use their professional judgment and spend more time on that than on the task of collating the information. Same for probation officers, who obviously have to record all of their decisions and exchanges, but collate that using AI and then let the professional use their time to make the professional judgment. So I think this is going to be a game changer if we can get it right, and we need to push it through.
Just to follow that up, in our enthusiasm for AI, we have to make sure that it's ethically acceptable too.
Yep.
We had a hearing with the DWP where 2 bits of AI had to be dropped because they would be deemed to be discriminatory against certain claimants. So can we bear that in mind as well?
Absolutely, and I mean, there are huge opportunities and risks, and we need to marry the two. In the end, I think your stance matters. Are you sort of forward-leaning, seeing the opportunity, or are you sort of leaning back, seeing the risk and not wanting to move? I'm in the first camp, but I absolutely accept that's got to be within a framework that means AI can be used for good purpose and safely. And I believe it can, but we need to bear that in mind all the time.
Thank you very much, Sir Geoffrey. Prime Minister, earlier you talked about breaking down the barriers, and one of the things that you've driven is a desire to reduce regulation. How much do you think that you're going to get tangibly in terms of economic growth by reducing the number of regulators we have, and how are you going to balance that with consumer interests and safety and other important aspects?
I think there's a large chunk of growth we can get by stripping away regulation. You'll be astonished at how many regulators and regulatory bodies that we put in place over the years.
Yes, I spend a lot of time looking at them.
Yeah, and you know, my own sense is.
But what tangible benefit? I mean, you know, it's stripping them away, but then there's a risk, isn't there, to consumers? And what can you give us an example of where you'll see actual growth as a result of reducing?
Just speed of decision making. As soon as you've got a regulator in place, you can bet your bottom dollar there's got to be a consultation with X, Y, and Z before a decision can be made. That then takes forever. There's a deadline that's breached, and nobody wants to do anything about it because you might come up against the regulator. And the sort of priorities of the regulator aren't necessarily aligned with what the government's trying to achieve. So there's a huge amount of work to do there. I'm not saying there should never be any checks and balances, of course I'm not. But what I think's happened over the years, which is perhaps understandable, is every time there's been anything that's gone wrong in government, the instinct of successive governments has been, let's put an arm's length body, a regulator, a check and balance, a consultation in place, to a point where now all of us, myself included, are pretty frustrated that when we want to get something done, it is taking far too long. I mean, planning would be the classic example of that, which is why we're putting through the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. And in answer to your question on growth, that is the single biggest non-fiscal matter that's ever been scored by the OBR. So they're very clear about the growth potential of getting rid of that element of regulation.
Okay, and so your mission boards will be looking at this. Will you pledge to publish the minutes of those mission boards so we can watch what you're doing in this area and the other areas we're discussing?
Well, let me go away and have a think about that, because I don't want to make a commitment that I can't keep. I mean, that is a place in confidence where I push hard my teams as to what they're doing. It's where ideas come to the table.
I think
I'll take away the challenge you're putting to me,
it's
which
just
is how can we make this more transparent? But I don't want to sort of say yes to the committee.
But in the drive for growth, are you mindful of consumers and the protections that regulators bring in? For instance, I mean, you know, the state of our waterways. If without regulation, goodness knows what they'd be like. I'm sure you can't support.
Yeah, but I don't think regulation is the only issue for our waterways. But look, I mean, the challenge you're putting to me is, let me go away and just think about how we can respond appropriately to what you're putting to me about transparency. But what I don't want to do is to make a commitment here that in the end doesn't work very well.
Thank you for your thoughts on regulation. Debbie Abrahams.
And good afternoon, Prime Minister. My questions are going to be on the Pathways to Work Green Paper. I think most people accept the need to reform our social security system, but also in terms of transforming, the need to transform our labour market to enable disabled people to flourish within it. But based on the evidence of similar disability benefit cuts, for example, in 2017, the work-related activity component of employment and support allowance, we saw that, unfortunately, there wasn't the deliverance of increased jobs for sick and disabled people. And in fact, we saw an increase in mental health issues and 28,000 sick and disabled people pushed into severe poverty. So how are we going to ensure that in terms of the reforms that are proposed in the Green Paper, that we won't push more sick and disabled people into poverty and further away from the labour market?
Well, I think firstly we need to learn the lessons, as you rightly point out, from the past, where proposals were put into place which in the end didn't achieve the desired end. I don't think that means that nothing can ever work. I don't accept that for a minute. And I'm very struck by the additional number of people that are now not in work. And I do think that the measures we put in place, the right to try work, for example, I genuinely think could make a huge difference. I've seen many examples, you yourself will have as well, of people who would like to take the step into work but are worried that if they do and they fail, then they won't get the work and they won't have the benefit at the end of the exercise. I've seen pilots of this that I've gone to look at myself, where some firms have voluntarily said, we'll do a sort of right to try scheme. And to my mind, and the evidence I saw in front of me, they worked pretty well. Not every case, I would admit, but they worked pretty well. And we need to go through each of the measures with that approach, checking it against delivery. But I am convinced that some of these can make a material difference, including the right to try work and the support we're going to put to people who want to get into work.
Thank you, Chair. So on top of the issue around lack of deliverability on employment outcomes, again, at international level evidence and also our own experience here of the last 10 years, we also saw that fiscal savings were not made. So given that the OBR has refused to score the supply side effects of the Green Paper, that JRF, the Joseph and Rowntree Foundation analysis indicates that not 250,000 people, as the government estimates, will be pushed into poverty, but 400,000. And that children in family poverty and adversity are five times more likely to end up as NEETs as young people. What needs to happen to ensure that the Green Paper addresses the root causes of this poverty and adversity rather than adds to them?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for raising that. On the impact assessments, it is significant to my mind that the ability of any policy or legislation to change any behaviour at all is not priced in. In other words, there is simply, the OBR have scored nothing against any change here. The assumption is not a single person changes their behaviour. I personally struggle with that way of looking at it because I do think that these measures will make a material difference, and they need to make a material difference. You talk about NEETs, and I'm very worried about the 1 in 8 young people who is currently not earning or learning, because there's a pattern here of young people who were caught, in my view, in the sort of COVID years, who've then gone straight into...
Can I stop you? I do apologise. I did actually mention NEETs. So there is new evidence that shows that it is child poverty and family adversity that are the key drivers of this. COVID does play a part, and particularly if countries like ours, countries like the US, which have a particularly bad experience of COVID. But it is, as I say, this is peer-reviewed evidence that is showing that it is poverty and family adversity that are the key drivers around this. So how are we going to make sure that we don't make that worse by pushing more families into poverty prematurely, or at all?
Yeah.
I think your point on the impact assessment one is very well made, Prime Minister. And again, it would I don't know if you're aware of what impact assessments are in the pipeline, because clearly what was analysed in terms of the poverty impact assessment, we had no employment impact assessment that there are real issues. So will you now commission independent analysis to ensure that we do have robust evidence, and so the policies that we are trying to implement for all the right reasons have the effects that we want?
Yeah, we have to have the right evidence base, and that is crucially important. We also have to do the work that we're committed to on child poverty and the child poverty strategy, which is proceeding because one of the achievements of the last Labour government was to reduce child poverty. And I want this Labour government to reduce child poverty as well. And that's why the strategy on child poverty is so important to us. As soon as we're able to share more details of that with you, we obviously will do so, so we can take your views into account on it.
Final little one, Chair, if that's okay. Well, on that basis, Prime Minister, I absolutely agree with you that we do need to do that work. Will you commit to not implementing legislation before we have the details of those impact assessments? I think that's so important. Otherwise, potentially, we will have policy that won't work and could actually do harm.
Well, as I've said, we need an evidence base, but we also need to get on with the work that we need to get on to. So I'm not going to make commitments in relation to timetabling, but I absolutely take the point you put to me.
Thank you.
Do you have an idea of the timetable for those announcements on child poverty?
Yes, but not sort of to the date. Can I write back to you on that? Just because we're working on it, and I'll be able to give you better information.
We appreciate the spending reviews in June, but some decisions are being made clearly before then, so it'll be helpful to know.
Yeah, I'll write to the committee with more details of that.
Thank you very much indeed. Sarah Owen, MP.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Prime Minister. I noted in your response to Ms Abrahams earlier the first question around wanting more disabled people to be able to work, and I think that's something that we all would like to see, that employers actually make the reasonable adjustments for people to access work. However, there are a group of people which the government's own assessments show that they are the most severely disabled group. These are people with limited capability for work-related activity. And for the future ones of those, there will be £3,000 worse off. This isn't a small group of people, this is potentially 730,000 people. So I want to ask you right now about how people are feeling about this. It's not often something we talk about in politics, but I think it is important because it's fair to say that your proposed changes to welfare reform have caused quite a bit of stress, I think, particularly among people with disabilities and their families. I'm sure many members have had similar things, but just some samples of what's come into my inbox. I am beyond stressed with anticipation of losing money. I have £700 to live on this month. Another one, the proposed cuts to disability benefits have left me feeling full of panic about the future and extremely let down. And the last one, I feel so sick, physically sick. The whole process is horrid. Please represent me. Prime Minister, what would you say to them?
Well, I think this question of how people feel and values is really important. And that's why sort of standing back from the technicalities of any changes, the guiding principles are really important, which is those people that do need support and protection should get support and protection. Those that want to bridge into work should be supported by the government to bridge into work. At the moment, my own analysis is that pretty well all of the rules make it harder for people to get into work, not easier for them to get into work, but equally those that can work should work, and we need to just apply those principles to the work that we are doing as we go along.
Prime Minister, my question was specifically about the people that are very unlikely to ever be able to work, the most severely disabled, of which in future there will be £3,000 worse off. And I just wanted to ask how you're working with the disabilities charities and organisations for which none of them that I can see have welcomed these plans. And I just wondered, I know that we're going through a consultation period, and I wanted to ask whether this is a consultation period on the policy itself or the impact of this policy, because I think that is very different. Will this consultation period actually alter or be able to change or perhaps bring people together on this in a way that we haven't been so far?
Well, I do want to bring people together on this, and it's very important we take different views into account. It's also important for people who have disabilities, which means they can never work, that they're not constantly constantly reassessed, because certainly that's something I've picked up as a constant cause of anxiety, and that's why I personally think we should be doing more protection, a premium for those that are in the most severe category and never going to be able to work, and also relieve them of the pressure of being reassessed when we know that the reassessment isn't going to make any material difference. So I do think there are things that we can do that will reform the system for the better, and certainly we need to take views into account in relation to that.
Okay, and we all agree that we do want to see people and more people into work, but I just wanted to ask why it is that the government have looked at disabled people first. One of my inquiries from my committee was around medical misogyny and people missing work due to heavy periods, painful periods, endometriosis, fibroids, ovarian cysts cost the UK economy nearly £11 billion every year. That's £11 billion. Would it perhaps not be more effective or just as effective to deal with the crisis in women's health, and what's the plan from the government to tackle that?
Well, there's a lot of work going into women's health across the government, and it's very important that we do that as well. And there are bits of guidance and legislation that we are bringing forward. So it is very important that we bear down on that for all the reasons that you've said.
Prime Minister, it can take around average for a woman to be diagnosed, only diagnosed alone, 8 to 10 years for endometriosis, one of the most painful, debilitating illnesses there are for women's reproductive selves. And if we are taking 8 to 10 years, that is 8 to 10 years that a woman is potentially out of the workplace, which is why we are seeing the cost of the economy at £11 billion. If we're looking at effective ways to get people into work, perhaps there are other areas that we should be exploring as well.
I completely agree with that, and that sort of time frame is just completely unacceptable. We've tasked the Health Secretary with reforming the NHS, and in particular dealing with health inequalities as he does so, because it is an example which is simply unacceptable. It's not capable of justification, and the health service needs to be better set up to deal with, and I think it could and should be. That isn't just about pumping more money in. I do think there are other things that we can do in the health service, but that will be part of the work that the Health Secretary has already been charged with doing, because the example you give is a very bad example, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend that that can be justified, because it can't.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Prime Minister, you were talking about the language being important. Do you think that it's important that the language that the Cabinet uses is important and not to demonise people? I mean, your Chief Secretary to the Treasury and the Chancellor both talked about pocket money in relation to the benefits. I just wondered if you are clamping down on that sort of language.
Of course language matters. I think every member of the Cabinet knows that. Occasionally people don't get it quite right. They usually apologise, and they're quite right too. But I completely take your point that language matters. This is the two values that have driven me in everything I've done as a lawyer and as a politician are dignity and respect. And dignity is probably the most important word in my dictionary. And the dignity of the individual and respect for individuals are the two things that I go to first when it comes to values. And to be fair, that's the same for the Cabinet, but you're right, and there's always the need to remind people about language that's used.
Thank you. Leila Moran.
Thank you, Prime Minister. So, following on from the question from Ms Owen in particular, thinking about those with disabilities, we had a round table, the Health and Social Care Committee, in this very room, and almost where I'm sat was a woman who described her experience of NHS and care. And the way she paraphrased it was, the NHS keeps me alive, but social care is what helps me to thrive. So, Prime Minister, how do you see the role of social care in our community and our economy?
Hugely. In its own right, and working alongside the NHS. And I think, like most people, I've long thought we ought to reform it, which is why we've asked Louise Casey to carry out that reform programme and to do it on a cross-party basis. She starts her work this month. I have expressly asked her to try to reach out straight away on a cross-party basis, because we need to reform social care. We need to make sure that if we do reform it, it's lasting reform. I don't think that that's possible unless it's a cross-party consensus about how we go forward with social care. It is hugely important, as I say, in its own right, and to complement what we do with the NHS. Very hard to get the NHS back working as we want if we don't also sort out social care.
Very true. Do you see social care as mainly a drain on the Treasury or as an enabler to the economy?
An enabler to the economy. My sister's a care worker, by the way, so I know this firsthand. I mean, absolutely, it's about ensuring that people can live to their full potential for as long as possible in their lives and have fulfilled lives.
Well, I'm pleased to hear you say that, but then do you share my frustration that much of the sector feels as well, that 3 years, which then butts up any decision close to an election. Now, when we've had social care reforms be kiboshed in the past, it has been during election campaigns. Surely the way to solve this would be to get this done and dusted during this Parliament, not kick it into the long grass, so that it can then be kiboshed at the next election.
Yeah. I mean, firstly, I understand your frustration that this has been pushed down the road too many times. The way I see it is this. One, we need to take time to get it right, and it needs to be cross-party. And Louise Casey is, in my view, the right person on a project like this. I've got huge experience working with Louise Casey. But that shouldn't stop us doing things straight away, to answer your question, which is why we made available £3.7 billion of additional funding for social care authorities in 25-26. That is really important as a sort of first step, and obviously took steps in relation to carers allowance, weekly earnings limit, a fair pay agreement for social for adult social care, hugely important. All the analysis shows that we haven't got a sufficient workforce. It's a fragmented workforce, and that most people leaving social care are leaving social care to go to the NHS because they can get onto an integrated framework for progression, which they don't have. So I think all of those things can be done before we even get to the bigger question. So I don't think we should rush the work that Louise Casey is doing. I think that's the right timetable, but I accept your challenge that what we can't do is to sit back until she gets to that part of her report and do nothing in the interim. And I think that the money we've put in, the fair pay agreements and other measures are really important. I should also say that it's among the reasons I commissioned Louise to report in 2 stages, one in 2026 and then later in 2028. And we can get the 2026 recommendations and start acting on them before we get to 2028. So I don't agree with you totally that we should just go sort of both feet in with all the reform right now. We need time on that, but I do accept the thrust of your challenge, which is we do need to do things now, and that's why we're doing what we are doing in the interim.
Do you accept that much of that money, in fact, has not been able to get to the front line because of the NICS increases? Well, social care sits outside, so whilst local authorities have had some money flow down to them, it barely covers the NICS increases for those social care providers.
I mean, it's £3.7 billion of additional funding. That's a huge uplift. It's 6.8% in cash terms.
But the amount that's going to the independent social care providers is about 800 million to
880 million.
Indeed, to local authorities, which is about the bill for the NICS increase.
Well, look, I mean, it's a huge cash terms increase that's
which isn't actually going to deliver anything new. It's just going to pay you.
Well, it's alongside the work we're doing on carers allowance. It's alongside the work we're doing on fair pay agreements, which I do think will make a material difference. You know, it's a significant amount of additional funding to the funding that was put in before.
But do you see
when times are quite, you know, when you know, as you will know, there are quite significant budgetary constraints at the moment.
Indeed, and you see the issue here is that we're trying to shift a dial, and the money that you're talking about is always welcome, but it's barely shifting that dial. Do you recognise that there is a cost to not reforming the system as well, both to human costs but also to getting people in work and keeping them in work?
Yes, that's why I want to reform the system, absolutely.
Because we are currently looking at this as a committee, but are surprised to find that the government has barely looked at it from that lens. So perhaps an undertaking from you to look at it through that lens would help the Treasury to see what you and I clearly both see, which is that social care is worth investing in. Yeah,
I've always approached this on the basis that the health service and social care are important for physical mental health and the support that people need throughout their lives, but they're also hugely important to the economy. For reasons we just rehearsed in other answers, but the obvious, which is the longer people are unable to go back into work if that's what they want to do, the worse it is for for them economically and for our economy more generally. So the two go together. And when we set out our plan for change, the number one mission was economic growth, but all the others, to my mind, ladder up to that, including what we're doing on health and social care.
Thank you. And just one final slight about turn. We have heard a lot of the conversation about tariffs, and you'll know in the past President Trump's approach to our NHS when it came to UK-US trade negotiations. He had his eye firmly on parts of the NHS. Now, you've said publicly that nothing is off the table. Does that include everything to do with the NHS, which includes drug patents, negotiated prices for medicines, and market access for US companies?
Well, I've been very protective of the approach we take to the NHS in any dealings with any other country, because it is our greatest asset and we are not trading it away. And that's the approach that I take here.
Including all the areas I've just mentioned?
Well, including the data that we hold, which is private information. It must be held securely. I do think there's work we can do on what use we make of that data, not so much in trade agreements, but right here in the United Kingdom in terms of advancing our own understanding of medicines and preventative measures. But I take a protective approach when it comes to the NHS.
Thank you. Chair.
Responding to Ms Moran's questions about the Casey review, that you're indicating that there's going to be some announcement or change introduced in 2026 in relation to social care. Did I hear you right?
You did, and I'm just checking my notes because what the timetable we've set is for the report to be in, or for her work to be in two parts, and the first part is 2026, second is 2028. And it's just double check
you
those.
You seem to indicate that you'd be moving faster on that first part in response to Ms Moran. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, Louise is starting her work this month. I've asked her to do her work in two stages. The second of the stages is what are the major reforms that are needed, and therefore the cross-party work that needs to be done. The first part is what are the deliverable changes that we can do right here, right now, without waiting for the wider reform. Right. I'm as sure as I can be, but I can't find the right page of my note, that's 2026. So I'm going to go for 2026. For the first part of the report.
Well,
if I'm wrong about that, I will write to you straight away. But it is to deal with this point, which is a good point, which is let's not just wait till 2028 and get towards an election and find there are problems along the way. Let's bank some of these changes as we go forward. And that's why I split it into two parts, so that we will get part one as a foundational stone to build on.
And also, in the exchange, you were talking about the national insurance contributions, particularly to support care workers, but local authorities and others are not getting enough extra money to pay for those employer national insurance contributions, so it's coming out of their core budget. Are you going to revisit that at all?
Well, as I say, I think the figure, again, it's not quite in front of me, is £880 million extra towards this aspect, which is adequate. I mean, we'll always have a look at what's adequate, but that's precisely why it was put there, and it is much more funding they've had to date.
Yeah, but it's just about making, if each individual care worker needs to have their national insurance paid for, and indeed others, if it's not enough to cover that, then that comes out of core budgets.
Yes, I mean, but it's additional money that's been put in, the work we did at the budget and the decisions we made are the very reason we've able to invest 26 billion extra in the NHS, which is beginning to make a difference. And that's a question of political priorities. And I'm glad that we put the money in the NHS, because I think that's the place it should be.
Well, there's always a trick, not a trick exactly, but government promises something, it makes a change, and then the public sector isn't always funded to cover it. So there's a gap there, I think.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
which is important to acknowledge. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Prime Minister, your welcome announcement on the abolition of NHS England gives a real opportunity to reset the finances of the NHS. Given that in recent years the health budget has gone up by 20%, but the primary care budget's only gone up by 10%, can I test some of your aspirations for local health provision, which is things that people really care about because it's very close to their lives? So can I start with health prevention, which will keep people healthier for longer and keep people out of expensive hospitals? The public health grant has gone down in recent years. We spend a pretty small amount on health prevention compared to the total health budget. What can be done about that?
Well, look, I'm committed to prevention. I think if we're going to take on the challenge of health going forward, then three things have to happen. We're going to need to go to a preventative model. We need to go to a model which is more community-based, so that it isn't the hospital that most people have to go to for healthcare. And we have to make much greater use of technology and AI, coming back to the conversation we had. But prevention has to be a large part of that. And I want to see more done on prevention, not less. There are so many examples of this. The one that sticks in my mind is that the most likely cause of admission to a children's hospital up and down the country is for children between the ages of 8 and 10 to have their teeth taken out because their teeth are decayed, completely avoidable. And we absolutely have to get into the territory of prevention. I think the two go together, AI and prevention, by the way, because not so much prevention, but a stethoscope working with AI on all 60-year-olds will be able to tell most people whether they're going to have a heart problem of some sort and intercept it before it gets to the stage where they collapse and go into A&E. There are so many examples, but my appetite for this is very high. One, because I think it's the right thing to do. Two, with all the, I don't think as we live longer have more health conditions, and living longer is a good thing. We sometimes talk of it as a great burden. It's a good thing, but we can't just pump more money into the top of the silo of the NHS to service that. We've got to change the way the NHS delivers.
Right, very briefly, dentistry, you opened it up. 24% of 5-year-olds have got signs of tooth decay at the moment. The major cause of hospital for not 5 to 9-year-olds is through dentistry problems. Our recent committee found that and was told by a senior health official that the dental contract is not fit for purpose and needs starting again. What more can be done to transform dental services, particularly in the southwest, where my constituency is, where they're dire?
Firstly, I mean, this is such an important issue. The contract needs to be renegotiated, and that is happening. We need to make sure that we've got much better provision for urgent dental appointments, and we have to deal with dental deserts, as they're called, which is places where nobody can actually get an NHS dentist. What we want to do is to incentivise dentists who have just qualified. It's a financial incentive to stay in the area or to be in an area where there's a desert, but we have to get to grips with it. It is ridiculous because it's costing a fortune. It's wasting the talents of. I saw brilliant individuals at Alderhay Hospital who are dedicated to extracting teeth from children. They're brilliant skills being used for that. It's completely unacceptable. We've also just started our work on supervised toothbrushing at school. And I know some people say, well, that's the nanny state, but I'm sorry, if the price of not doing that is a child going to Alderhay Hospital to have his or her teeth taken out, then I don't mind supervised toothbrushing, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Sarah Champion, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, friends. You know that defence and foreign aid go hand in hand in preventing conflicts and dealing with humanitarian crisis. So now that you've slashed the aid budget, I'm interested, who do you think is safer in the world?
The aid budget was slashed in order to spend more money on defence and security, because I think that we are living in a very fragile world, and one where it's absolutely imperative that we up our defence spending, which is what we've done, as you know, by a direct transfer. The That's not a decision I wanted to make. I absolutely did not want to make that decision. And I think it's really important that we do a number of things off the back of it. One is be really clear what our priorities are within the budget we've got in terms of, Sudan, Gaza, Ukraine, etc. But two, to absolutely commit that we do need to get the aid budget back up, and I want to be really clear about that. But the third thing is, but this is, forgive me, because I think it is really important, because it's a good challenge you put to me. I don't think we can sit back as a government and say that until we can get the aid budget back up again, we don't do anything. And that's why I've had active discussions with the World Bank, other institutions, other countries, and the private sector about how we can leverage aid financing in a different way using the private sector, how we can better coordinate and cooperate with other countries. You will know this firsthand, but the amount of money that goes into some countries or capacity and not into other countries. And there are like-minded individuals, world leaders that I've spoken to, who are up for a really in-depth discussion about how we do this differently in the interim, which I think is a good thing, and I would like to actually work with you on that.
Let me focus on you and your vision. The Centre for Global Development and Save the Children have done quite detailed analysis on the cuts that you've made, and basically you'll have to axe all bilateral support for education, water sanitation, nutrition, sexual and maternal health, and support for women and girls. So you spoke about your vision. I'm not sure what's left, but what is your vision for development going forward?
I think it's hugely important for countries that we want to, and it's in our own interest to work with in relation to our priorities. We haven't yet gone through the priorities, so exactly what we will be able to do and what we won't be able to do will be set out in due course, but we're working through that.
What's the vision? What do you want to do? So if you were starting with a blank canvas, we understand the financial constraints. What is your vision for development?
Well, a healthier, thriving world where we reduce conflict and tension and corruption and ill health is the intention. Obviously, what I have to do is to balance that within the resource that we've got, and at the same time recognise that we're in a new era when it comes to defence and security in Europe. When I say we're in a new era for defence and security, that isn't just words. That is and I think around the country people really understand we're in a much more volatile position we've been in for a long time. Old assumptions about our defence and security, which have kept the peace for 80 years, are not as solid as they once appeared, and it is my job to ensure my number one responsibility is the security and safety of this country. And I firmly believe the only way to do that is to ensure that NATO, which has been the cornerstone of that for 80 years, is the cornerstone for decades to come. The only way to ensure that that's the case is to ensure the European element of defence and security is rebalanced against the US to ensure that strategically we ensure that NATO lasts for many, many years to come. And that's why I've given it such a priority, because it is we're at a very important point in our histories, in my view.
Thank you. Another cornerstone, I would argue, Prime Minister, is international law. I'm not a lawyer, but it feels to many that Israel is acting without any accountability towards international law. You are a lawyer and our Prime Minister, so can you please tell us how the UK will comply with the International Court of Justice's legal opinion on Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine? And can you outline how the UK will implement our legal obligations under the UN General Assembly resolution? Yeah,
look, I mean, I was an international lawyer. I think that marks me down, not up. But of course I believe in international law, and I accept it underpins everything we do bilaterally and multilaterally.
So what are we doing to hold countries to account?
Sorry?
What are we doing to hold countries
to
account?
We are members of various courts and institutions, and that is one way of holding countries to account. But we also hold countries to account bilaterally in the discussions that we have at whatever level, whether that's leader to leader, whether that's foreign secretary to foreign secretary. we are critical of Russia as the aggressor in Ukraine because it's in breach of the UN Charter. That is a rules-based system. It is the basis of our criticism. It's the reason that almost all allies across the world, particularly in Europe, are putting in the amount of money they are, because Russia is the aggressor, and it's a rules-based system.
And Israel and the occupation of Palestine?
Well, again, I think the occupation is unlawful. We've said that, or that's been long-standing government policy. In fact, in fairness, the last government as well. And we are members of the international institutions.
I've spoken to many humanitarian workers around the world who feel that Israel isn't being held to account, particularly when it comes to international humanitarian law. So will we be pushing for an inquiry into the 15 humanitarian workers that were killed on the 23rd?
Oh, I mean, there's got to be an investigation into that. And we have to be absolutely clear that we're not just talking about that isolated incident. There hasn't been enough aid getting into Gaza at speed and at pace for a very long time. The resumption of hostilities is the wrong thing, in my view. We need to get back to a ceasefire. We need to get aid in. We need to get the hostages out. And we need to put our foot in the door for a process, however remote it may seem today, towards a two-state solution, which is, to my view, the only way of guaranteeing peace in the long term. And I do appreciate that may seem a long way off at the moment.
My final question, if I may. I'm interested that you've decoupled aid from the ODA commitments. If the Chancellor's right and GNI goes up, and indeed if the Home Office is right and they're able to get down the refugees who are in hotels in this country, will the aid budget go up as a consequence of this?
Well, firstly, I'm absolutely determined to get the hotel bill down wherever it falls, and it shouldn't be falling where it's falling at the moment. Exactly. So it needs to come down. It shouldn't fall where it's falling. I'm not going to make a commitment to exactly what path we'll take to get aid spending back up again, but I can tell you that that's what I want to do, because I do believe in what we've done with our aid and development for many years. And therefore that is where we want to get back to. But I don't want to wait until we get to that point. I want to act now to find other ways of doing what we need to do on aid and development with other partners, partner countries, the private sector and institutions. And there's an appetite for this because other countries are in the same position as us when it comes to budgetary constraints, so they want this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Prime
Minister. Thank you. Tandesi MP.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Since Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the thousands of North Korean troops that came to help Russia invade Ukraine, now President Zelensky has confirmed that 2 Chinese citizens have been captured by Ukraine's military fighting for Russia. What would your message be to the Chinese president?
I've only just seen the development of this. I haven't had the opportunity to take advice from my own intelligence and security advisors. I haven't had the opportunity to talk to President Zelensky about it. So I'll very happily provide you with an answer, but if you'll forgive me, I just want to make sure that we've got to the bottom of what we actually think has happened here before giving a definitive answer here. I will obviously be taking intelligence and security advice on it. We will obviously be talking to the Ukrainians about it.
Okay, thank you. Since you last appeared before the committee, Prime Minister, there's a new administration now in the White House with very different defence and economic priorities, which has certainly disrupted the status quo and has considerable defence and national security implications for our country. Now, you recently announced an increase in defence spending, but given the raised real threats that we as a nation face, will that be enough, especially given the geopolitical earthquake, with the US effectively saying that European nations, more or less, have to fend for themselves? Well,
let me unpack that, because there's 2 or 3 strands to it, all of which are important. Firstly, the commitment to 2.5% by 27-28 is the highest sustained increase since the Cold War, so it is a significant increase in spending, and then on to 3% in the next Parliament, in accordance with fiscal circumstances and, of course, general circumstances. I do think that's the adequate response at the moment, but in relation to the second part of your question, I think it is right that Europe hasn't done enough in its own security and defence for some time. I don't think it's just this President of America that's said that. Previous presidents have said that. I don't see that. I accept that challenge. I think particularly in the circumstances we're in, we need to rise to that challenge. I think this moment's been coming since Russian tanks went across the border into Ukraine just over 3 years ago, and it's important that we've now acted. I do not see that as an argument for Europe to, as it were, go it alone in its own collective self-defence and decouple from the US. I strongly believe that we've had 80 years of peace in Europe because of the alliance with the US and because of NATO. I think our task now is to ensure that we lock that alliance in for the future. That means that Europe must do more. So we're talking to our European partners about that. In direct answer to your question, is 2.5 enough? I think there are lessons from Ukraine we need to learn with our European partners. One is better coordination of our capabilities, because many European allies have made capability available to Ukraine, but actually it's not been as easy as you might think for Ukraine to make the best use of that capability, because we haven't coordinated in the past in what we're doing. And we need to think carefully about how, if we're all increasing defence spending, we do that as a group of countries in the most effective way. That's a live discussion that's going on at the moment, which goes beyond the pure question of percentages.
Good. Prime Minister, we of course need to work with our allies, especially in Europe, and you have done a great deal of work with respect to that. But what have you done to ensure that UK defence companies are not elbowed out of the EU's 150 billion euro defence fund and subsequent contracts?
Well, firstly, we should welcome the Defence Fund. That is a significant step forward by the EU and, to my mind, some real leadership on that issue. As you know, third countries are not locked out of it. It depends on defence and security arrangements with the EU, and therefore I do think there is a way for us to work with the EU on this issue. So I've welcomed it. I want to work with the EU on it. It is very important that our defence companies are involved. We've got some of the best capability in this country, and we need to ensure that they're able to be an essential element of this.
Yeah, well, we are definitely at a very pivotal moment for our collective defence and security in our continent. But do you agree that now is not the time for European nations to be prioritising fisheries over defence, and that now is a time for unity and solidarity?
Now you're tempting me to get into it. I think that we can have a much better relationship with our EU partners on defence, on security, on energy, on trade and our economy, and I'm determined that we will be ambitious in what we're trying to seek. Of course, there are issues such as fisheries, which are important to any discussions. They necessarily, because of the nature of the agreement that was signed by Boris Johnson, that you have to visit this periodically in any event. But one of the things I said at the beginning of this process was that I think the best way to make progress in our discussions is not to do it through what I call megaphone diplomacy, where we all go to the papers or the media and shout about things that may or may not be frustrating. So I do think we can make some real progress on these issues, but I'm not going to be tempted into sort of inflammatory language, which will make it harder, not easier.
Agreed, without mentioning any nations. But lastly, you've done a great deal of work on the International Reassurance Force, a coalition of the willing. Now, how many British forces will be involved in that, and will there be a US backstop?
Well, the way that we've taken it forward with the Coalition of the Willing is to create the political momentum through the countries that meet at leader level around the table. And Emmanuel Macron and I are sort of bringing that together and doing what we can to provide the sort of leadership to that political grouping. We've then tasked the military side to do the detailed operations on land, air and sea. The stage we've got to now is with our senior defence officials working now very closely with the Ukrainians about what that might look like, where it's going to be deployed. Obviously there's a lot of optionality at the moment because we haven't got a deal. We don't know exactly what will be needed, but that's where we've got to. So I can't give you numbers and dates, but it's broken down into various categories. A plan for what we're going to do in the air, a plan for what we can do in the sea, and a plan for on the ground. But the key now is to build that around Ukraine's own capability, so it's not a substitute for it, which is why I've had my team in Ukraine in recent days in that detailed discussion with the Ukrainians and others.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Chiamura MP.
Thank you, Chair. Prime Minister, you have embraced science and technology as drivers of growth. Platform technology and AI are dominated by a small number of US companies. Your Secretary of State for Science and Technology, Peter Kyle, said these companies are so powerful the UK needs to treat them as sovereign states. Is that what you are doing, and how is that reflected in trade talks with the US?
Well, they are very powerful companies, many of them based in the US. We are very attractive on AI as well, obviously. We're amongst the top 3 in the world when it comes to AI, with fantastic capability here. And we want to and are working with those sectors wherever they are. In relation to trade talks, obviously there are questions about the appropriate way to tax digital services, etc. There are questions about how technology impacts with free speech. I've been very clear in my view that we need to have an arrangement for digital tax of some sort. And equally, we need to be pioneers of free speech, which we have been for very many years in this country. But at the same time, we rightly protect under the Online Safety Act, further provisions of which are coming into force pretty quickly. And when it comes to dealing with paedophiles and protecting children, I take a pretty strong line that we take the necessary measures in order to do so.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Part of the power of these, well, let's say sovereign companies is their pocketbooks at a time when we are desperately seeking investment. Google's R&D budget is over twice your government's. Microsoft's market cap is 3/4 of our entire GDP, and of the £63 billion announced at the October Investment Summit, which you mentioned, 2/5 of that was from the United States. So isn't it inevitable that British tech policy will be made in Silicon Valley? And how can we ensure that the benefits of investment, growth, jobs, skills, security are fully captured by communities and businesses in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, I mean, we set out, you'll no doubt have seen the AI Action Plan earlier this year, which sets out how we want to interact with those businesses, with the sector generally. That's been welcomed across the piece in relation to the framework that we put around this. We obviously now need to move that forward. But the investment in terms of the second part of your question, which is how's it felt in communities here, the investment is investment into this country, into data centres. We've set up growth zones for AI. And I think there's huge potential for us in relation to AI. We already have, as we go into this revolution, which undoubtedly will be, we're not starting in the same place as other countries. We are already right up there at the top in our capability with what we've already got in this country. And the individuals that have been leading it for us, who are extraordinary in this country.
It's clear, Prime Minister, that we have huge strengths when it comes to AI. I think my question was more around the investment and our sovereignty over the impacts of the investment, given that we do not have control or the funding for that investment, given that those investment decisions are not being made in the UK. But I'd like to. I'll move on now to the summer riots, which followed the misinformation of the terrible Southport attack, and which was amplified by TikTok, Facebook, and X, as well as by Russian bot networks. Now, the Online Safety Act, which you mentioned and which is currently being implemented, does not tackle misinformation, which may be why the tech companies told my committee's inquiry that the Act would not have changed anything. So how is your government addressing misinformation? And will you take action against the algorithms which amplify misinformation and the bot networks which spread it?
Well, in relation to the information that was being put online in the immediate aftermath of the Southport murders, the first thing that was important to establish was that where that information incited violence, it was already unlawful. And there was a sense among some people that somehow online was a law-free zone. And I think it's very important that we established the principle that it's not, and therefore where people incite, action can be taken against them. In relation to misinformation, obviously there were provisions that were being argued about here in relation to the Online Safety, then Bill, now Act, which didn't make their way into the Act, and we need to look at what we can do. Obviously, gauging what is information, what's misinformation is always difficult to police, and we have to be proportionate about how we do it.
The deliberate spreading of false information, disinformation, threatens our security and our democracy. China spends between 8 and 10 billion pounds a year on information operations. Russia spends about half that. What are we spending to counter state-backed online disinformation? And do we have the powers to effectively enforce regulations on global platforms?
On state actors, we do bear down on it, and it is amongst the things we look at when we're looking at our security work. As to exactly how much, I don't know off the top of my head what that is, but I'm very happy to write to you or to write to the committee, whichever is appropriate, with more information in relation to that.
Thank you. And finally, in a one-word answer, it's in a changing world, sovereign capability is reassuring, and it ensures that we develop the requisite homegrown skills, but we don't have a sovereign foundational AI capability. Can we defend ourselves without one? Yes or no?
Yes, we can. Of course we can. But, you know, we should always be ambitious about what else we can do.
Thank you very much.
Tonya Antonazzi MP.
Prime Minister, in the government's plan for change, national security is described quite rightly as the first duty of government. But as you know, defining national security, making judgments about national security isn't always straightforward. For 28 years, the family of Sean Brown has been seeking truth and justice in relation to his murder. The coroner couldn't move on last year, Prime Minister, because material was being withheld on grounds of national security. I've met Mrs. Brown and her daughters. They showed me 56 pages of blocked out text, but not one word on any of them, Prime Minister. The coroner has said there should be a public inquiry. The Chief Constable of the PSNI has also said that this lack of disclosure about offences as serious as murder would simply not be tolerated anywhere in the UK. The court have now told this government twice that a public inquiry is currently the only way for Sean Brown's family, including his 87-year-old widow, to obtain the truth they have waited for. What does the government plan to do?
Well, The Secretary of State's been clear that we want to see a full investigation into the murder of Sean Brown. So that's the first position. Obviously, we acknowledge the recent Court of Appeal judgment, and secondly, we're fully considering it because it is a concerning case for all the reasons you've set out.
But what does this ruling now mean? Because ICRA is, we are being told, but by my committee, our committee is being told, is not fit for purpose and not suitable in this case. So what does this actually mean for the government's timetable in introducing primary legislation to replace the Legacy Act?
Well, it's important we don't delay what we need to do in relation to the repeal and replacement of the Legacy Act. And so we need to get on with that. But also we do need to carefully consider the Court of Appeal judgment. But the primary position is still there needs to be a proper investigation, criminal investigation, as to what happened in that particular case.
Yeah. Look, and reconciliation, you know, requires constructive relations with the Republic of Ireland. We visited Dublin recently, heard from a range of stakeholders. We've also taken evidence from a number of victims and survivors organisations in Northern Ireland, and they all say that the Irish government, as well as the UK government, is not doing enough to address the legacy of the past. Are you able to tell us what the government is doing, to work with the Irish government to develop these new mechanisms that are needed to address the past? And do you believe that the current work and the pace of work is actually adequate and good enough?
Well, firstly, let me acknowledge that what you're saying. I mean, as you know, I worked in Northern Ireland for 5 years, and therefore I know firsthand how acutely these issues are felt in all communities, and how important it is for us to build trust and confidence in what is undoubtedly a really difficult part of the process. And my years in Northern Ireland were very formative for me personally, and matter hugely to me. In relation to the second part of your question, it is really important that we work very closely with the Republic of Ireland. Of course it is. We have, I think, got relations between the UK and Ireland into a much better position now than they've been for many years. We had a summit a few months ago where we set out our ambition for how much further we could take this. Amongst the things we discussed were this very issue in terms of areas in which we need to work more closely together, and I remain committed to that.
Okay, and the Independent Commission on Reconciliation and Information Recovery, ICRA, you know, their remit and structure, do you envisage it changing in the way that the Chief Commissioner, Sir Declan Morgan, seems to advocate, and, you know, which will then include direct participation by the Republic of Ireland? Well,
I mean, this is what the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland is currently engaged on. I know firsthand that it must have the confidence of victims in particular if we're to make real progress, and therefore we'll continue to work on the basis of trying to get that confidence into the work that we're doing. But the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland is working very hard and actively engaged in it, and is well respected, our Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and that's amongst the reasons I appointed him into that post when he was shadow, and then reappointed him as the Secretary of State when we won the election.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms Antonazzi. Prime Minister, our colleagues on the Joint Committee on Human Rights, like you, I'm sure, are concerned about, like all of us, the instances of foreign governments moving beyond their borders to take action and persecute people in the UK. Obviously, we've had the Hong Kong authorities targeting individuals, the shocking situation with Yulia Skripal and Sergei Skripal in Salisbury in 2018, and activity by Iran persecuting journalists here in the UK. I just wanted to ask you if the UK, how you're planning to address transnational repression practice, particularly when you're having diplomatic meetings with some of the countries where this is perpetrated.
Well, firstly, you highlight a really important issue, which is state action in this country, which is growing, and state-based threats. And we need to be aware that that is growing. And I can assure the committee it is an important strand of the work that we are doing on defence and security all of the time now. It is constantly raised in international discussions that we have for very obvious reasons, but it is a serious threat. I think we generally underestimate that threat, and it's very important that we're alive to it.
And the government is reviewing its approach, or the UK's approach to transnational repression. When are you planning to publish that review? And if you don't know, perhaps you could write to us.
I don't know off the top of my head, but I mean, I'll again make sure I find out and send through the details to the committee so that you've got it.
Thank you. I think, yes, if you write to us, but also the Joint Committee on Human Rights.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, I can either write to you or to them or to both.
That's fine. And Prime Minister, you might be aware that this House has hosted members of the UK Youth Parliament
yes.
in the Chamber. They recently had their annual sitting. It's made up of more than 300 young people aged between 11 and 18. So we all got to watch for our jobs, I think, as seeing what they did on the day. They came here. And we caught up with them. We have I should perhaps put an advert in for our podcast, Committee Corridor. I'm sure it's your top listening material, Prime Minister. But maybe that could be part of your preparation next time. And we asked them what question they would put to you if they were here. So let me ask you what they wanted to ask, which is that they were highlighting the fact that the government promised as an election in the manifesto to lower the voting age to 16. But that's for, of course, for UK Parliament elections and local elections in England and Northern Ireland. Of course, in Scotland, it's there already. The commitment wasn't included in the King's speech. So they want to know, Prime Minister, when might they see legislation coming forward on this issue?
We will definitely get it done. It's a manifesto commitment and we intend to honour it. I think that if you're old enough to go out to work, if you're old enough to pay your taxes, then you are entitled to have a say on how your taxes are spent. And also we do have voting at a younger age in different parts of the United Kingdom, and the sky didn't fall in. It's a commitment we made, it's a commitment we intend to keep.
Okay, so you're trusting 16-year-olds with that, and they also wanted to know whether you think there should be more political education. Certainly that's something they wanted to see in order, if they're voting at 16, to be well educated in making their decisions as a voter.
Yeah, I would term it as sort of more education about citizenship rather than sort of pure political indoctrination, but citizenship and how the state works, how you participate in it, what the institutions and structures are. And I'm very pleased to see that is part of the curriculum, and I think it's important that everybody learns about citizenship.
So, and of course, there's a curriculum review going on with the Secretary of State for Education, so you're leaning into seeing more political education. Can I read that from what you said?
I don't want to preempt the outcome of that review, but there is a review going on. You're absolutely right about that.
Okay. Well, Prime Minister, can I thank you very much indeed for coming today. And to those who are listening or watching, there is a transcript which will be available on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days for those who want to pore over every word the Prime Minister has said today. And we hope, Prime Minister, that you get a bit of a break over the Easter weekend, especially in the middle of all the major challenges going on around the world. And I think it's fair to say that all of us wish you all the best in negotiations over tariffs and the big global economic shocks that we've been facing this week. Thank you. And
I appreciate that. Thank you to the committee.